Hello and welcome to episode 76 of the Sustainability Report podcast, your guide to sustainable leadership, innovation and strategy in the sports industry. I'm Matthew Campelli, and in this episode, we'll be exploring a collaboration between the Ocean Race, the World Sailing Trust, the Magenta Project and PA Consulting, who are aiming for an equal gender split of sailors competing in the Ocean Race from 2030. Representing the Ocean Race is Anne-Cécile Turner, its Sustainability Director, who explains the practicalities of making this vision a reality, such as mentoring, shadowing, alterations to rules, and making sailing an inclusive sport for women and other underrepresented groups. Dee Caffari, the chair of the World Sailing Trust and the first woman to sail solo around the world in both directions, reflects on 2019 research by the World Sailing Trust that found women had often experienced discrimination at sea. And we also discuss what needs to be done to change this landscape. But kicking off the episode is Jonquil Hackenberg, the chair of the Magenta Project, who talks us through the genesis of the partnership and how she will take the findings of the World Sailing Trust further into new pieces of research. Enjoy the show.
Yeah, so it came about through a conversation with Anne-Cécile and Vicky Lowe and I, and we just said, right, how can we bring to the fore strengths and demonstrate that strengths on a boat is what needs to be addressed, rather than looking at it specifically on a single gender lens. And so the collaboration was essentially, how can we make this tangible so we can actually make a step forward in what is a challenging industry?
And in terms of timescale, when are we talking here, Jonquil? When did the Horizon Project really first come about?
It started off, so the conversation started last summer, and we really kicked it off in autumn of 2021.
And Cecile, what was the Ocean Race's role in that? How did you kind of, how did that manifest from your point of view?
From the Ocean Race point of view, we have been working on that topic for a long time. And if you remember, during the last edition of the race in 2017, Mark Turner, the CEO at the time, really pushed with the courage to change the rules and integrate more combination in the boat rules to facilitate the inclusion of female sailors, allowing at least 2 female sailors to win the race, which was unheard of, and every boat in the race had a female sailor, and we wanted to build on that, to pursue the legacy and to make sure that we facilitate pathways. So in a way, we've been pioneer in this field, but we understood with the discussion with World Sailing, with the Magenta Project and with PA Consulting, that we could do much more by creating something that will, open the gates, broaden the horizons, and facilitate pathways for young female sailors sailing in the optimists out there, wanting to reach the pinnacle of offshore racing.
I guess a lot of this kind of follows the strategic review that was conducted by the World Sailing Trust, which obviously you're chair of. Can you talk to us a little bit about that review and maybe how that's kind of informed this project?
Yes. I mean, at the time, it was considered quite a groundbreaking piece of work. To those involved in the industry, it probably came as no surprise. But when you actually do the research, have evidence to support what you're saying, and it's written down or said to you factually, people can't help but sit up and notice. And it was probably uncomfortable listening for many people within the industry. It's not as far advanced as we'd like to think it is. And although great things are being done, we're still struggling. And it's a conversation people are uncomfortable having. So hopefully the review, what it's done is it's opened up that opportunity to have that conversation. And now we're talking with events that are at the top of their game, with the best sailors in the world taking part, addressing these issues and making change. So I think it's really been a catalyst for this change happening. And I think it's exciting at what can happen, and that people are welcome to help be facilitated in making the change in our sport.
What did you actually look for in that review, Dee? What kind of questions did you ask? What kind of stakeholders did you kind of question? And what were kind of the key takeaways from the review?
It was really open to anybody involved in the sport at any level, whether it's a participant, an organizer, a parent. It really was open. And we had over 5,000 responses worldwide, so across the globe. And it was all about, what's your experience? And it was a very easy questionnaire to fill in, but it did dig through a number of layers. If you gave one answer, it took you down a different route. So it kind of tried to unfold what people were hesitant to say out loud. And we found that was discrimination, there was sexual harassment, there was people not being included due to their gender, not being welcomed. And people don't like to admit to things like that, but when you say it and people kind of look honestly at what they've seen in their careers and what they've seen happen, it shouldn't come as a surprise. But what we've got to do is move forwards and address that so that we can make the changes. There came 9 really clear recommendations from that review, from all these answers. And it was really good then to kind of actually put them down, grouping them under policy and best practice, and then increasing female participation, and then developing female leadership, which we thought was really lacking in our sport. So those 3 areas have covered the 9 recommendations that came from the review.
Before we talk about the practicalities of how this is going to address that review, you're getting the solid data. People are talking to you. They're kind of talking about things that hadn't previously been discussed before. But as a female sailor, had you experienced the discrimination that you'd seen within this report? Was it familiar to you from personal experience?
It's interesting because as a participant and as an athlete within the sport, I've been forging ahead and pushing my agenda, and hadn't really considered what the barriers were. You're constantly looking, if I'm going to do this project, how do I get the support behind me to do it and make it happen? But then when you are asked to look critically at what have been the barriers, how many other females were participating, you realise actually I was forging forwards in an arena that it was quite unusual to do that for. And you start to realise what you have been up against. And through my career, I've been one of the minority. And I realise now that it's a responsibility I have as an athlete that's forged my career to open up those pathways so that it's not so difficult for the generations following me. If I'm going to be an inspirational role model, then I need to make it easier for others to follow in my footsteps. So the conversation now where we're talking with people that want to support, follow those recommendations, change the narrative for the sport of sailing at these pinnacle events and show that it can be done with confidence, I think that's fabulous. And I'm all for it, which is why I'm really keen to support the change going forwards.
And Cecile, from the Ocean Race point of view, when those findings came out from the World Sailing Trust review in 2019, what was your reaction? Were you surprised? Did you expect it? How did you feel when you saw those that data?
I have to say, I was not expecting this. I was quite surprised by the disparity of the numbers. I mean, it's quite shocking, and I didn't really realize, and that's why those research are so important, because I really didn't realize that the numbers of participation were dropping, that the equality rate is catastrophic, in reality. So it's also made me, want to act even faster in the role we have. We are not recruiting crews, so we have a limited scope, but we have the race and the event, and we can send a sign to the industry.
And now the Horizon Project is taking that forward. There's going to be a big in-depth analysis of the state of gender equality in professional sailing. Jonquil, can you tell us a little bit about how you're going to take the World Sailing Trust's work forward in that respect?
Yeah, sure. So I think looking at the strategic review, as Dee referenced, we really took it to the next level. And so what we did was we said, right, okay, if sustainability is not going to be just about environment, it has to be advanced through gender equity as much as anything else. And if we can do this in the world of sailing, then it's a brilliant example to spotlight that for other industries. So we really took the hallmarks of what a strong diversity, equity and inclusion strategy looks like. And they were things like, how do you ensure equal pay as well as equal play? How do you get to invest at all levels? And how do you make big changes quickly and shine a spotlight on good behaviours? And so really what we did was to tie in how the mentoring program that has been provided by the Magenta Project for female sailors to move into performance sailing, how that can help play a tangible role in actually taking the recommendations of the strategic review, the strategy that PA Consulting put together around what this would look like and how this can be put into practice and reality.
And then when we talk about putting it into practice, I think, Dee, you kind of alluded to these the three key kind of steps. You know, the increasing the pipeline of female leadership, increasing opportunities for women in boat design and manufacturing, which is really important, and just general diversity and inclusion. Maybe let's start with the beginning. I mean, Jonquil kind of alluded to this kind of the mentor scheme, which is really important for fostering and engaging, you know, a new generation of leaders. You know, how you know, what kind of practical steps do you think the collaboration will go through to increase that pipeline?
I think mentoring in itself, we see it in business all the time. If you want to advance, you have that guidance or that reference or that sounding board to try things out with, so your development can move forwards. And why should sport be any different? And there's that old adage that if you can't see it, you can't be it. Well, when you're in this male dominated environment trying to progress your sport and your career, you don't know where to go and you don't know what you're doing wrong or who to talk to. But that mentoring scheme just allows them that security, that sounding board to get advice, to have that encouragement and that support and generate that self-belief that you need in this environment. So I think it's really powerful, and we've got a really good group of both men and women that can offer that support network. And that's really important, because for females to develop and move forward, you need the male champions to support it.
Whereabouts have you kind of found these mentors? We've got a mix of male and female mentors. How do you go about identifying you know, the kind of right people who perform that role?
Well, that's probably best placed by Jonquil, because the Magenta Project have done a fabulous job at doing a mentoring program and connecting the mentees and the mentors that are right for their pathway, whether they're looking at dinghy sailing, Olympic careers, offshore careers, or management within the sport. And it's normally come from a volunteer role where people are like, yeah, I've got the time and I want to give back to the sport and help make change happen. And that's the key thing, is believing in what they're doing. And I think that it's really shown its strength, where the mentees have gone on, developed their career, and then they've come back as mentors as well. They've gone through the process and they want to help the next group go through. So I think it's really powerful when you start to get that momentum behind this system.
Yeah, Dee summed that up really well. And I think what we have seen, so the Magenta Project started out, of course, with ocean race participants in 2014-15, and that's the mentoring program stemmed from that. But Dee also alluded to the fact that we can't make a change in sport, specifically in sailing, by just starting with performance sailing. It really starts all the way up, and it starts from children sailing in oppies. And part of the research PA did was also to talk to some of those children, as well as the performance and professional sailors at the other end, to understand what the barriers are. And all of that is then feeding into a mentoring program that's also run by the Magenta Project, as Dee said, but that can be participated in and shared in all different, whether it's dinghy or keelboat racing. Anyone can set that up based upon these recommendations and strategic way forward.
Well, I mean, we kind of spoke about it a little bit earlier about some of the barriers to the sport, particularly in terms of discrimination for people who are actually sailing. But when it comes to getting more girls into the sport and more women into the sport, what kind of other barriers are we seeing, Jonquil, that need to be overcome?
It's interesting talking to 8 and 9-year-old children, which was part of this. They point out some really, really simplistic things, like when girls get their periods, for example, nobody considers how they handle that if they're racing out on the water as children, and so that's quite stressful for girls. In a similar fashion, they find that the boys are quite shouty on the water, and so these kind of things are simple simple voices out of the mouth of babes that allow us to put in very, very tangible and practical steps in place. And it's really good that the classes hear this, because that then builds up as children become adults. What else needs to be taken into consideration? But those would be two such barriers. The other barrier at the other extreme is you're going to hire people to be on your boat who look like you, who you are familiar with and who you know. And it feels like a risk to hire somebody or work with somebody that you don't know. And what the research and the recommendations in the strategy that PA did was to say, actually, a mixed skill, multidisciplinary team is going to be much more powerful than if everybody thinks and breathes and talks the same way that you do. So those are kind of the two ends of the spectrum, but both which needs to be taken into consideration in order to make an effect change in sailing.
And Cecile, I know that you said that the ocean race is decentralised and the teams have kind of autonomy about how they go about doing things. But in terms of this familiarity and trying to find people outside of your kind of inner circle to bring onto your team in different kind of different roles, how can the ocean race help to facilitate that kind of thinking?
Yeah, we've thought about that, and we've done a solid DEI, diversity, equity and inclusion plan across 3 areas of the race. So across the whole workforce, across the race village, and across the sailing area, obviously. And we are really trying to do an exhaustive job to understand, how do you enter the race, whether you're a volunteer, race management, race official, across the whole perimeter of the race, at the host cities as well. And we've put together and we've worked a lot with the HR department of the ocean race to make sure that we facilitate the inclusion across all the recruitment process, including the volunteers. And one thing, Jonquil, you were mentioning about the barriers to enter, and we felt and we've understood from the research that one of the big barriers is also a perception thing, a bias in behaviors that are that we want to work around that and around the communication that we put in place. So before, create things as simple as creating a database of images of female sailors, that when we represent the race, that these images are starting to spread out as well. After all, we are a big communication and inspiration platform for many. So we need to think across the whole organization. How can we change perception and lead by example, across the race? And it's not only on gender, it's also around across the whole diversity topic, including ethnicity, cultural background, gender, age, sexual orientation, physical abilities, you name it. It's a big, big topic.
When you say perception, Anne-Cécile, you mean sort of people from different groups, females, people from other ethnic groups, they'll see images from the ocean race and they'll just assume that they don't belong there because they don't see people like them. Is that the kind of perception that we're talking about?
Yeah, exactly. It's the idea of the image we give of our sport. You often see a lot of male on board, male in race management, males in race officials, on the water, off the water, and I think if we start by recognizing the power of communication and starting to make it more equal, as soon as you choose a TV anchor for the race, for example, that could be also a representation of diversity. And so on across our events, the Ocean Race Summits, across our different ways to communicate about the race. We need to think about that. The OBRs as well, the onboard reporters. So it has to be, slightly, slowly, surely integrated in all the recruitment briefs, the onboard reporter briefing, and across the whole communication aspect as well. And
Dee, your organisation, World Sailing Trust, is going to be launching a diversity inclusion working group, or has launched one. That I suppose we'll kind of look at these things in a bit more detail as well. Can you tell us a little bit about the sort of timeline with that working group? What you expect the milestones to be within that piece of work?
Yeah, as you can imagine, change takes time, and it's quite hard to take everybody on the journey at the same time. So rather than define by this time it has to happen, it's a work in progress. What we are seeing is that more women are prepared to speak up and kind of put their heads above the parapet, which is great, and you need that. But also there's a lot more males involved in the sport that are willing to support it, which is the only way it can happen. So it's a evolution. But I think by being in collaboration here and the ocean race being such a pinnacle event, showing that they're proactive in everything they do at all levels, addressing these recommendations, making change happen, is absolutely critical. Because once you get one highlight sport that's at the top of its game doing it, showing it that it's possible and in such a positive way, then the others will want to jump on board because they want the same recognition. So I'm seeing this will be the moment where it'll be a catalyst for other events, and the conversation will then become easier from that.
Do you envisage collaborating with other sports? Or have you spoken to other sports as well and trying to kind of get this together kind of in a broader sense?
Well, we collaborate in other areas, be it circularity and carbon reuse with other sports, be it tennis rackets and bicycles and things. So there's no reason why we can't collaborate further on other topics. And I think other sports are ahead of sailing, for sure. And I think we've got a lot to learn by what other sports have already done. So rather than trying to reinvent the wheel, we need to collaborate so that we can learn from each other and everybody move forwards together. It's the fastest way we're going to affect change.
Jonquil, you spoke a little bit a minute ago about the barriers to actually competing on the water for girls and women, and kind of Anne-Cécile talked a little bit about officiating and some of the other roles, around ocean racing and sailing in general. And I know one of the key parts of this piece of work is looking at how you can increase the diversity of people who are designing boats, manufacturing boats, the real technical specialists. Kind of what are the barriers to those kinds of roles for women and people from other backgrounds, and how do you go about kind of breaking those down a little bit?
A really good question. So, as you very rightly point out, the challenge around gender parity or diversity and equity is across the entire value chain of sailing, and therein lies an opportunity. So, borrowing from other sports, borrowing from designers and innovation is really key. So, women in STEM, for example, and any organisation and charity that's focusing on bringing more women into engineering and design of boats and indeed of equipment and clothing for women to wear on boats is going to be critical. It can't just be on the boat itself. If you see the boat as the boardroom, we need to have an influence across the entire value chain. And that's something that Anne-Cécile's also mentioned. But for example, umpiring in sailing, something like 87% of umpires are currently men. And so we need to put in place programs that, the World Sailing Trust is also looking at, which is going to encourage diversity across all aspects of the sport and not just the race itself.
And what's your view on that? You kind of mentioned it a little bit earlier, particularly with regards to the officiating, but in terms of getting women and the people from other backgrounds into the other roles around, particularly the technical roles, what kind of challenges do you envisage with that?
Well, it's quite challenging simply because we need to change behaviors, we need to change perception, and there's simply not enough qualified candidates for all these roles at the moment. So that's why we need to open up the pathway, think ahead, think long term, think training, and think to include all these groups. But what I've seen and we are not boat builders as well. So even though we're working on that topics, for example, with our Sustainable Boat Building Innovation Workshop series, we want to, put that topic on the table and try to understand, what's the pathway to become a, female engineer working in the boat building environment. There are a few organizations already working on that topic, but we also want to send a sign that first to understand what's the route, and then send a sign to all our family stakeholders to say this is possible. And when you talk to the sailing teams, when you talk to the people who are actually the younger ones, for them it's totally natural. So I think I'm quite hopeful for the next generation that they will be much more inclusive in their recruitment process and in the way that they're building their boats.
Dee, for the people who are listening to this podcast who are not who don't know an awful lot about the ocean race and sailing, when we talk about 2030 being a kind of being kind of a milestone or a target for gender parity. All three of you have kind of mentioned some big challenges. You've talked about change being quite a long-term thing. If we look at 2030, is that a bit of a stretch goal from your point of view? Is it really achievable? How would you kind of characterize the challenge of getting gender parity by 2030? Is it going to be really challenging, or do you think it's really, really achievable?
I think it's ambitious. I think we're putting it out there, and it will be a challenge, but I don't think it's undoable. And I think there was a lot of pushback when the ocean race took the mantle that there was an incentivized rule to encourage female participation within the teams. And there was a lot of pushback against that because on both sides, the men wanted to sail with who they're comfortable with and who they're used to sailing with, and the girls didn't want to be there as tokenism. Mm-hmm. But actually, the reality was it made sure that a female was on every team, and the end result was females therefore were involved in winning the ocean race, which had never happened. So I think after the initial shock of the change, people kind of got on board with it, and it was what it was. And people then realized that when you sail in a mixed team, it actually makes no difference. It brings out the best of both. It ups the female game level, and it levels out the testosterone levels for the guys, and it's a really nice environment to sail in. And so the rule then stipulates, well, let's have a certain number of females, and everybody's thinking, well, do we need rules to make this happen? But the reality is, yes, we still need that, because we haven't got far enough down this road for people to just do it naturally. People are still going to go with who they're comfortable with and who they're used to sailing with. So we need to kind of force it to happen for a bit longer until it becomes natural. One cycle isn't enough. So we need to kind of move this forwards. And the ocean race has the power to make this happen by forcing it initially and then seeing it come. And I think one thing they did really well way back was to bring in a under 30 rule, because otherwise we were getting the same salty sea dogs going around the world lap after lap. But now we've got new raw blood, and everybody realised actually it's quite good having some young blood on board. And those guys then become the experts and the experienced ones, and they bring the next new lot through. So the youth focused really helped, and it helped grow the diversity pool of who's involved. And I think this is doing the same thing. And I see it as a good thing. And definitely I see the younger the teams are, the more open they are to the idea. Just as Anne-Cécile just said, young teams don't really care who sat next to them, so long as they're doing the job that they're doing brilliantly. If you do the job well, I don't care who you are that sat next to me. And that's what's really nice. And I think it's quite refreshing. My last team was fully mixed, and 80% of them were under 30. And it was like a breath of fresh air going around the world with them. I learned as much from them as they learned from me. And I think gave confidence for the race to go forwards in kind of pushing down this road. So while it is ambitious, I think it is definitely doable. And let's get some new blood going around the race course.
Yeah, I mean, that is a really interesting point when you talk about the rules, because I think the more and more I'm hearing around sustainability, environmental and social in sport, is that the way to get things done is to change the rules and make people innovate and adapt to the rules. And Cecile, I mean, this is a really interesting point I'd maybe like to explore further with you, that, I think a lot of people, like Dee said, when it comes to changing rules in sport, there's a lot of pushback. I think there probably would be a lot of pushback in sport to change rules to kind of accommodate more environmentally or socially sustainable kind of initiatives. But I mean, do you feel that that's the only way forward? And if it is, what kind of lessons can other sports learn from the ocean race in that respect?
Well, it's a very interesting topic, because that's exactly where, I stand. The rule is an accelerator in all our sustainability topics. And sometimes it can be seen as just a line in a notice of race, which are the rules for the race, but it has a significant impact across the whole industry. When we've changed the rules of the game by including renewable energy on board, so now every boat needs to be powered by a minimum amount of renewable energy, then it sends a sign that's the direction we want to go to. When we ask everyone to carry scientific device on board, at least not being able to refuse that, it's also a sign that they need to contribute to the understanding of their playground. On diversity, I can tell you there's a lot of discussions and assessment within the rules. We cannot commit to change the rules yet, because at the moment we couldn't do it for this race. Even 2030 seems to be very ambitious, but what we're trying to achieve with this Horizon program is to send a sign that this is where we're going. We want to create natural pathways, open the gates, facilitate access and inclusion. We had a few ideas around, for example, deliveries after races, to open places on board for potential mentorees coming from the Magenta Project. So we know these candidates are already qualified, they have the profile and the level, they just can't get on board. So we're trying to find clever ways to open the gates, and then the rule will come much more naturally, because we'll have enough. But sometimes you need to give it a bit of a push, and that's where legislation, that's where policy makers, and that's where rule makers can accelerate change as well. As we all know on this sustainability topic, we need to create change at scale and at speed, and we don't have much time. And the social element of it is so important. It is what will make all our criteria for change to be achievable. So that's a interesting topic, and sometimes controversial. But I really also salute the courage and the ambition of the management team of the Ocean Race, who understands that topic, and embrace it. And even though they know it's going to be a challenge, quite happy to follow the journey with us.
So, Jonquil, what's your view on that? Rules, sport, is that the kind of best opportunity for quick changes that Anne-Cécile and Dee are talking about?
So there's two really key things, which I think the Ocean Race really, really understands. If we flip this to the sponsorship angle of sport, sponsors in sport from a corporate level are really looking to associate themselves with two things. One is sustainability or climate response, and the second is diversity and inclusion. And brands and corporates are increasingly shying away from being associated with sports or sports people who are not embracing one or ideally both of those things. So by putting a line or an ambition in the sand with the Horizon Project, it will hopefully also drive interest from a sponsorship angle, and that sponsorship angle is going to help drive and move the dial forward. So that's one kind of key aspect, and we've seen that in the past with racism in football, for example, racism in cricket, the scandal of Yorkshire cricket in last autumn. So that's one really, really important thing. The other thing is the world stage, and so we've got Davos running right now this week. And the ambition that was set out in 2015 was to end poverty by 2030, which was ambitious, right? And there's 17 goals associated with that, and there's a recognition that sustainability is not just environment. You can't advance environment without advancing societies and communities. And a large part of that is diversity. And so by putting a line in the sand and saying, we as the Ocean Race are going to forge forward. We as the Ocean Race cannot do this on our own. That's why we're partnering with World Sailing, with PA, with the Magenta Project. But additional partnerships and ecosystems are needed to affect that change really broadly. And that's really the message by being that leader or the first voice and putting that line in the sand that this programme is going to drive forward. I think it's hugely exciting, and it's showing it is possible if challenging, as Dee says.
Well, what are those kind of additional partnerships and ecosystems that you see to kind of facilitating this, Jonquil?
So it's with additional sports. It's learning and leveraging from different industries and innovation. It's brands, and because all of this takes time, but it also takes money and investment in younger sailors to bring them up and encourage a lot more diversity at that level. So it's branding and sponsorship. It's boat designers saying we want to be associated with a sport that is much more diverse. It's communications, as Anne-Cécile mentioned. So how do we report on diversity and showcase people who look differently from just the the white men who've been sailing around the world for a while, the saucy sea dogs, as Dee said. So it's all of those aspects of saying we want to be associated with a sport that's forward thinking and leading, so that we don't lose participation in sailing, which is currently dropping.
Dee, you kind of seeing this now? There's a kind of young, you talk about the fact that there's young, fresh blood at sea now. More emphasis on inclusion. Are brands and and sponsors responding to this? Do you feel, and can they accelerate it further?
Absolutely, I think this is a key attraction for sponsors. They're addressing in their own business life diversity and inclusion, sustainability, all these aspects. And so when they partner with a team or an event and they want to be seen by the public, they want to be seen supporting those same aspects that they're considering important to their business. And if they're going to capture the imaginations of either their clients or their workforce, they need to show that it's genuine, that it's not just a tick box exercise that they're doing at work, but actually they mean it, and what they support reflects what they're doing at work. How do you empower your female workforce? Well, show them that you mean it by empowering an event that includes diversity and has a big focus on this. So I think it's absolutely critical to some sponsorship packages now, and just the days of a floating billboard is not enough. You need to have a purpose, you need to be genuine and authentic, and you need to communicate what you're doing to your customers and your client and your workforce as well as you can, so that it reflects, that sponsorship is a reflection of an extension of your work, of your office, of your corporation. It's how you're perceived. So I think it's absolutely critical for them.
Anne-Cécile, what's your view?
Well, it's very interesting because it's also a source of potential new sponsorship money. Corporations now have the EI, diversity, equity, and inclusion budgets now. And we are, in a way, creating an impact platform that is accelerating, as Dee said very well, the perception of who they are. And the sponsorship is so efficient, and in terms of transferring brand values from the organization to the sport, and the other way around, from the sport to the organization. So that's why sailing is leading the way in sustainability, because we are seen and perceived as very in touch with the outdoor, with the elements. We can be powered around the world with renewable energy as much as possible, not 100% yet, but and we are the symbol of the ultimate symbol of sustainable mobility, and on those social topics, which are a bit less talked about and less visible, it's so important as well. So if we are leading on environmental topics, we can also lead on social topics and lead the way. And the vision of a modern, inclusive sport should be perceived, for the sponsors as a very strong asset for their sponsorship platform, and a way to engage, all their stakeholders as well.
As well as sponsorship, I think, Dee, you spoke a little while ago about being on a mixed boat and how it was a really good experience. And I know there have been so many studies around how a diverse boardroom reflects a more a better performing company in the kind of corporate world. Could this be kind of replicated in a kind of a boat, a sailing, racing situation where you have a more diverse group of people, sailing the boat, making better decisions, potentially even having a better chance of winning the race? Is that a step too far, or would you feel that could be the case?
No, absolutely. I agree with that. You're not going to get diversity of thought without a diverse group of people sat around the table. And I think everybody brings a different perspective. And so long as you can manage the environment and create the atmosphere where people have the confidence to speak up and feel that they're not only being heard, but actually listened to, I think that makes a massive difference. So it's how you manage that environment, especially when it's a new environment that people aren't used to. And a boat, while there's a level of responsibility, given that it's often life and death situations, it's also, you've got to have buy-in from the team. You've got to know what you're trying to achieve and how you're going to go about it. And it's like, these are the options. This is my preference. This is what I think we should do. and that's your time. Speak up if you think of anything else. Let's put it on the table so that we all agree and we all buy in and we all go there at 100%. And you're always planning for the what ifs and what's next. And people think differently. So I think if you can create that atmosphere and environment where people feel they can speak up, you're going to get the best from the whole team, and that will reflect in performance. Absolutely.
Jonquil, I know that we've got the main kind of objective is a 2030 target, but obviously you have to have smaller kind of milestones and objectives between now and that time. If we were to sit down this time next year to do another podcast, have another chat, another interview, what kind of things would you like to see that you've achieved over this kind of first initial period of the collaboration?
So I'd say what I'd like to see is that we're starting to see more. If we talk about the mentoring program from the Magenta Project, that we see more women or aspirational professional sailors coming through that program, and that will be done through collaboration and more volunteers taking place. So I think that's one. I'd also love to see in classes, starting with Optimus, but moving all the way up the value chain, is similar such programs and investments. And what one example is Foiling Week, where they're really focusing on, how can girls and women lead the conversation around strategy for a race. And by putting that out there and showing that women are leading that is, again, it's not just a male voice. And that's really exciting, particularly in foiling, because it's kind of now the cool sport that spans across different aspects of sailing, or indeed windsurfing. If we start to see those things and talk about those stories in a lot more, I think that'll be very, very powerful. So I think seeing that move and shift across different sailing classes, seeing more women coming through the mentoring program and finally reporting on this so it becomes the norm is going to be really hugely exciting. That's what I hope for.
Anne-Cécile, if we were to sit down in 12 months' time, what would you like to say you've achieved?
Well, it is a critical moment for us because at the moment the teams are starting to recruit their crew. And we also, full speed around the sponsorship deals. So I'd love to see, and to make a proof that our Horizon program is working, and that, at the start of the race, it is actually mid-January from Alicante, Spain. We have maximum number of female on board already in the race, so that then we don't even have to change the rules. It's already happening.
And Dee, before we finish up the episode, the last word with you, what would you like to say that has happened over the next 12 months?
I'd like to see the ocean race. Obviously, it is leading the way with its crew ratios, but that spills into the officials and the management, and that other events want to follow in the ocean race's footsteps. I think I want to see them set the benchmark where others aspire to go to.
Thank you to Jonquil, Dee, and Anne-Cécile for contributing to a fantastic episode. Really looking forward to watching future ocean races with more diverse crews, officials, and technical professionals in the coming years as they work towards gender parity in 2030. If you enjoyed the episode, please subscribe to be notified about future episodes. And don't forget to let the people in your network know about the #1 place for sustainable leadership, innovation, and strategy in the sports industry. Stay well, and goodbye for now.